Okay, we are now live, and we've got 4 reactions already. The indicator doesn't show 4 people yet, but they're here because they reacted, so we know that. Okay. So we'll wait a while until more people join. And hi, everybody. Hi, Stevie. I see you. And Gopal.
Joe, will I be able to replay this later on?
Yes, okay. You will be able to replay it. It will be on Facebook. Okay. And within a day or two, it will be on YouTube also.
Oh, great.
Okay, and then there'll be, the YouTube record, will be there for good. Okay, the Facebook record, will be there also, but usually the Facebook record is harder to find, than the YouTube record of it. I'm not sure why that's the case. I think it's the search function inside of Facebook is not as good as the YouTube search function. So here we go. Ginger Bowman says hi. Mark Fabian says hi. And Dave Pilkington, hi, everybody. And Rob Rivera says, hey, Yoda, a doubleheader. Yeah, Rob, a doubleheader. And Mark Fabian says, hiya, Joe. And he welcomes you, by the way. Also, Richard. And Gopal smiles and exhibits some dark glasses in his smile, which I think is to tell us that he's really hip. And Tom Murphy greets us all. We're still going to wait, a little while longer because we have 7 people now, and I'd rather wait until we're close to 20.
Oh, okay. I noticed that people are coming on.
Yes, there are people coming on. It looks like Trish is on now. Okay, Trish is watching from Tanzania. Okay, Trisha Roberts, this is.
Oh, and Tatiana Lewis was with my campaign.
Okay.
How do I see it?
Okay, great.
Where do I go?
Oh, Tatiana Lewis, yes, I see her. Richard Hart for Nevada, indeed. And Trisha Roberts from Tasmania. Okay, I forgot to show our names, so I'm going to do that now. You are Richard Hart, and I'm Joe Firestone for Real Progressives. Okay, Richard Hart is running in the Nevada 3rd District for Congress, and he's running as a Democrat in the primary in a crowded race where there are some 5 competitors, Richard?
Excuse me, sir?
There are 5 people now competing.
Yeah, 6 actually.
Actually 6.
Yes, including myself.
Okay, so it's a busy race.
It sure is.
Okay, so it's time for you to begin to lay out your ideas and your policy agenda. And I think we're all really, really interested, in learning about that.
Okay. Well, Joe, first of all, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be with you this evening.
Okay, thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with you, too.
Okay. I'm running because, number one, I'm concerned about immigration and DACA. I come from a background where my father was born in Mexico and came to this country, became a citizen. And immigration is the core of this country. It's our backbone. And it's unfair for any party especially the other party, Republicans, to not put together something for dreamers. They were brought to this country through something that they did not do, but they're the core of our country, of our economic. They're doctors, they're nurses. I know in the hospital, my mother who passed away in 2015, many of the nurses are. Without those nurses, where would those patients be?
Yes.
You go to Northern California, our produce industry. Here in Las Vegas, the restaurant industry. I mean, they're the hotels and everything else. So they are a big contributor to our economy. To send them back to wherever they came from, because even though Trump says it's all from Mexico, they're here from all over, as we are ourselves. It would be a burden economically, both the expense in sending them back and jobs that nobody would be doing. So that is a big concern to me. And because of my background, because of my grandfather's background, I've taken it very personal. But I'm also with foreign policy. I feel that we need to reach out to our neighbors. Going into war is a last concern. We can't even take care of our veterans. We have veterans who have PTSD. Member of the veterans group has lost in the past month 2 of his friends since Christmas who's committed suicide. Going into war needs to be the last result. And I like to say that if I was in Congress during the time that Bush put through the package to go into Iraq, I would have voted no. We just don't go into war easily. We don't put our men and women in harm's way. That is a big concern. I know Trump is unpleased with what Barack Obama did with Cuba, but after so many years of it not working, we had to try to do something, reach out to them. And
so I think you'll find that your audience here is very friendly to the positions that you've taken thus far.
Yes.
Okay, but I'd like to ask a question about them. Okay, and I personally, am very friendly to the positions also. Okay, that you've taken thus far. Okay, my grandparents, were immigrants. Okay, and I believe, as you do, that one of the great strengths of this country, is the immigrants who have come here and contributed so much.
Of course.
Okay, so we are, completely together on that. Okay, but I wonder why you, and other people who really empathize with the dreamers and who would like to see them stay and continue their contributions to America. Okay, I wonder why you don't go on the offensive and begin to advocate not for a path to citizenship, for the dreamers, but for immediate citizenship for the dreamers. In other words, they are here for no fault of theirs. They've grown up here. They are Americans. And there's not a reason in the world why they shouldn't be citizens right now.
I agree with that.
Okay. What I wonder about is perhaps you should begin to advocate for it. I know it seems like it's way out there, but for many of us, it's not really so way out there. It only seems like it's fairness, and justice. And so anyway, that's what I would say. That's one question, that I would ask, and that's how I would answer it. And I don't know how many other people would answer it, in that way. Maybe some of the people who are here now, would tell us. The other thing is, with respect to the positions on wars, and the votes that have been taken, and the kinds of votes that you would take okay, if you went into Congress, how about the vote in relation to going into Afghanistan? Would you have supported that vote?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay, could you outline your position for us on that vote? Okay, that's a little different question and a more difficult one in certain ways.
I believe that going into both Afghanistan and to Iraq, former President Bush did mislead the country. We needed to do much more work prior to just putting our men and women in harm's way before rushing into either Iraq or Afghanistan. And I believe that is the problem with, at the time, a lot of members in Congress, as well as the Republican administration, who rushed into this. And we ended up seeing it more as a haven for terrorist activity, terrorist groups. And that's how I saw it.
Okay. Well, what about the Libyan intervention? Would you have been for that?
That I would have been for. And I think the people finally spoken with the Libyan president and overthrowing him and what they did. But, I mean, there are situations around the world where we do have to protect our interest. What I'm saying is we need to really look at the situation before we just start sending in troops. And that's what we need to do first. I think a lot of stuff nowadays not with the previous administration, I think President Obama really tried not to go into situations, tried to deal with it. He tried to implement a program. He tried to talk peace because now it's not a matter of just going in militarily. We have the problem with Korea. We have mass weapons that'll not just wipe out one country, but it can wipe out our country. So we have to be very careful on what we do. This is not back in the 60s and 70s when we went in with troops. We're now talking about mass weapons, and I think that's a concern. And I don't think one person, meaning the President of the United States, should be the only one with his hand on the button. I think it needs to go to the Congress. And because we get into a situation where you have somebody like our current president, and what's to not stop him from doing that? I think this is a
so. Would you roll back the situation then to a time when the president needed a declaration of war from the Congress?
Yes, I
would. Actually begin hostilities?
Yes.
So you would go that far?
Yes.
So the obvious question, okay, before I ask the obvious question, okay, I'm going to say that I would go back that far also. Okay, but the obvious question that people would ask us both, okay, if we were in the position is, well, what do you do in case of a nuclear threat? Okay, in case of a nuclear attack, okay, or a terrorist attack on American soil? But shouldn't the president have the authority to immediately respond to those? So how would you answer that question?
I feel that not one person should have that responsibility. Should there be an immediate threat like there was during 9/11? Immediately the president does have access to the leadership in Congress, to both parties, to his CIA director, to his Secretary of Defense. And I think immediately when there is that problem that comes up, then immediately they've got to make the decision together, not one man, but jointly.
Right. I also think that in the Afghanistan situation, there was a time period necessary anyway before they could go to Afghanistan, okay, and intervene there. They had to mount a significant effort, okay, to go to Afghanistan. And that was going to take time too. So it doesn't seem like there was a time factor in there. It seems like the president had ample time to get a declaration of war from the Congress in that situation if that were actually required. Okay, I think the situation of a nuclear attack, though, is really somewhat different. If that were to present itself, if we had a first strike, I think in our present world situation, that's a very unlikely event. Okay, but I think people would ask you that question. Okay,
yes.
In any case, okay, what you would do. So, so you would have to be ready to answer it in some way. Okay, I'd like to move a little bit. Since we started talking foreign policy, I'd like to continue talking foreign policy for a while. Okay, but I'd like to move a little bit to the question, okay, of trade. Okay, and here's my question. The current trade agreements that we are still negotiating in some form, even though the TPP is gone, okay, for the time being, okay, and even though NAFTA, okay, is on the ropes for the time being, and similarly with the TTIP and the TISA, and the whole idea of these complicated kinds of of multilateral treaties, we still have very active efforts to construct smaller scale bilateral treaties in the foreign trade area. And various justifications are given for trying to negotiate those treaties. The most popular one is the free trade justification. Okay, then there are other people who justify trade really on a managed trade kind of basis. In other words, one can look at the people who put security considerations first in terms of negotiating the trade treaties as advocating for a managed trade kind of position, which means that we negotiate the trade treaties not really for an economic purpose, but really for a foreign policy purpose, so that there's a management criterion that comes in here related to our national interest in a broader way. Okay, and then there are also the people who advocate for trade treaties that produce a balanced trade kind of situation. This is something Warren Buffett has done. Okay, and then there are other people who advocate very strongly for fair trade treaties, and they mean usually two distinct things by that. There's the fair trade idea that we do not trade with countries for products that are actually produced in an unsustainable way, or that are produced using labor that violates human rights. Okay, there's that kind of position in trade. And then there's another notion of fair trade also, which comes from the viewpoint that the nations who enter into trading agreements are unequal in their abilities to trade, because some countries are highly developed, okay, and other countries, okay, are undeveloped. And those countries are not, since they're not at the same stage of development, they require more protection, okay, than the developed nations do. And the trade treaties ought to recognize that, okay, and to make a provision for it. So those are the standards you see in the trading arena now. What you don't see is the idea that each country, our own and all the other countries in the world also, ought to be constructing trade treaties which are consistent with the public purpose of those countries. Whatever is meant by the public purpose, and the ideas on public purpose will be different, okay, in each of the countries. Public purpose is an abstraction, and it can mean a lot of different things. For example, in the United States, it might be considered to include such things as price stability, about full employment, rights of labor, impacts on the environment, okay, favorable impacts on the environment, trade consistent with climate change considerations, and a whole set of other criteria that all come into the idea of serving the public purpose, and then further integrating with the general idea that the government ought to be implementing policies, both foreign and also domestic policies, which are consistent with the public purpose, and that's what the meaning of serving the people really is.
Right.
Okay, so thinking in terms of these ideas, what would be the criterion that you would use in order to evaluate the trade treaties that are proposed to you when you sit in the Congress?
I think in terms of, we have to do a balanced trade, also with the labor force who is behind it, whether we're dealing with a country that we're dealing with factories that are not using child labor. So we have to be very careful. We have to really look at the situation on who we're doing with our trade, but also making sure it's balanced for both our country and the other country.
When you say it's balanced, what you mean is that, largely speaking, there are no large and continuing trade deficits.
Correct.
That one nation is suffering
right, compared
to another nation,
like it's being done now.
So that seems to be somewhat of a cross between the position that Warren Buffett takes, okay, and the position that the fair trade people take.
Right.
Something of a fusion of the two.
And I think we need to come down to the table and really work out these things, not just jump to these trade treaties. We've got to work it out so we do it properly. And like I said, balance, but we've got to bring both groups to the table.
So how would public purpose fit into this then?
Excuse me?
How would public purpose fit into trade policy that was evaluated by these criteria?
I would like to see people like Warren Buffett and other in his industry who would be brought to the Congress and would have a part in putting this together. I like to say, as I'm running for office, we have elected officials who are in office, and some are teachers and some are lawyers, but not one person, not one elected official is familiar with certain things in industry that they're not a part of. So we've got to bring these business leaders to the table. We've got to sit down with them and say, help us put together a plan.
Well, what about the labor leaders and the climate
labor
scientists?
Labor is a very important part of our trade. My father was a labor union organizer, by the way. And I believe in labor, and I believe they should be a big part of what's going on. And I think over the years, we've ignored labor. It's not as, we're not reaching out to labor like we were back in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Would you vote for card check?
Excuse me?
I said, would you vote for card check?
That I'm undecided about right now.
Okay. Well, do you know about card check?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So you know what it is, and you know the labor movement in general strongly supports that.
Yes.
And one of the gripes against the Democratic Party at this point is that when the Democratic Party came into full power during the period 2009, okay, and 2010, they failed to fulfill their promise to pass card check.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so, all right, so let's leave card check. And okay, perhaps this is the point where we ought to transition to domestic policy. This seems like a fair
covering both.
Yeah, you know, like a fair place to make the transition. Yes. Okay, since we began to talk about the, you know, labor unions and card check, okay, things like that. Okay, we're in a circumstance right now where the economy is supposedly percolating along after some 9 years of a recovery period, and where people are talking about, certain economists like Paul Krugman, for example, is one very good example, is talking about full employment, that we have or are close to full employment. Okay. We apparently, though, still have a labor market which is just beginning to recover, in that wages for the first time in a very long time are starting to rise. And then also there's the question of the statistics and how accurate the statistics now are at measuring the levels, okay, of unemployment. If you use the U3 statistic, it shows the level of unemployment at roughly, I think, 5.5 million, right, if I recall correctly, or something like that, okay, in that particular neighborhood. And if you use the U6 statistic, then perhaps another 6 million, okay, get in. So there might be a total of 11.5 million unemployed, where so we have had certainly considerable recovery since the crash, okay, of 2009, when the U6 was probably closer to 26 or 27 million, okay, or something like that. But there are some people who say that the problem is even worse than that, because there are many people who have left the labor force and are recorded neither in the U3 nor in the U6. But we know, even from the economy back in Bush's time, when the economy was doing fairly well before the crash, that the labor participation ratio at that time was roughly 0.67. And now it's something like 0.63. So it turns out that if you projected the labor participation ratio out to what it was, okay, in Bush's time, and even then, okay, the economy was far from being a strong one for the labor market, that you would actually find that there were another 11 million people who, in a tight, full employment economy, would be there to take jobs at a living wage. So then you get to some people saying, hey, really, there are 24 million people who are unemployed at this point. So this economy is still lacking a great deal. So what do we do about that? So I'm putting that question to you. What would you do about it?
I think what we've got to do is we've got to, number one, and it's a two-way situation, invest in our infrastructure. We've got to do what Roosevelt did back during the Great Depression with our roads and highways. The high school I went to out in California was built on Roosevelt's program. It put people to work, and it also improved our roads and our highways and our buildings and hospitals. We need to do a program like that. That's something I will be vocal on. That's something I will fight for.
Okay, the American Society for Civil Engineers says that the gap in infrastructure right now will require $2.2 trillion of additional spending over the next 5 years or so. Now, in quoting that figure, they're backing off from a previous figure they had only 2 years ago, where they were quoting 3.6 trillion, okay, as the size of the gap. I don't know what caused them to lower the gap to 2.2 trillion. I seriously doubt that we had infrastructure spending that closed that gap by 1.4 trillion in that time. So I suspect there was a little political pressure placed on the ASCE to come down to 2.2 trillion. But that's still a considerable amount of spending. Over a 5-year period, it's maybe $400 billion in infrastructure spending per year. Would you be in favor of that and champion that and really fight for that?
Yes, I would, because we spend a lot of money elsewhere. What this would be doing is this would be putting people to work, and this would be improving our structure, whether it's the highways and buildings. It's a twofold situation, and I think we spend money elsewhere. I think we've got to look at the long run on what's good for the country, what's good for the people.
Okay,
That's
so you're in favor of an FDR type of program, okay, for infrastructure, right? Okay, and how do you feel about the Medicare for all issue? Where do you stand on that issue?
I believe everybody has to have insurance, and how I see it is there were some problems with Obamacare, but there was some good with Obamacare. We don't dismantle a program. We improve on it. We take out the parts that were not working, and we improve on that. And the way I look at it, it's like Social Security. Roosevelt implemented Social Security. It's had its rough issues over the years, but they've improved on it. They've improved on Medicare and Medicaid. And so everybody has the right to have affordable health care. But we don't dismantle Obamacare. Those that can't afford insurance should be given Medicaid.
Okay. One of Roosevelt's economic rights, of course, was the right not to affordable health care, but the right to health care, period.
Right.
In time of need. It's fairly obvious that in much of the world, in the industrial world, okay, the majority of nations either have a Medicare for all situation, or they have even a national health service situation, which is to put a label on those things. The Medicare for all situation, okay, is a socialized insurance, and the National Health Service type of situation, also the VA, is actually socialized medicine, to use that old inflammatory term.
Right.
Basically, that's what it is, and there's a distinction between those two things. Hey, it's only socialized insurance. It's not socialized medicine. Okay, but anyway, the point being that they have that system, okay, in those other nations, and they spend a far smaller proportion and get better results when measured in terms of statistics than we do, but they spend a far smaller proportion of their national income on healthcare, okay, than we do. Most of those countries spend 1/2 of what we do as a proportion, okay, of their GDP. Okay, and even the countries that are the most expensive, apart from ourselves, say Switzerland, only spends 2/3 what we do. Germany spends less. Canada is down to 11%, okay, of GDP, while we are up at over 17% and on our way to 18%. $3.4 trillion per year we spend on healthcare today after Obamacare, after the Affordable Care Act. Looking at that $3.4 trillion, there's no deficit spending involved.
No.
Every dollar comes out of private sector pockets, yours and mine. If we could reduce those costs by 1/2, then we would save the private sector $1.7 trillion worth of healthcare that would be in most of our pockets and not in the pockets of the insurance companies. So that's part of the argument for Medicare for all. But there's another part of the argument which is very, very important. And that is that before Obamacare, actually in 2005, the death rate, or the number of deaths that occurred due to lack of insurance, based on a Harvard study, was 45,000 a year. Now, everybody kept quoting that 45,000 a year.
Right.
They were quoting it in 2007. They were quoting it in 2008. They were quoting it in 2009. They were quoting it in 2014, even though our population had increased from something like 290 million to the current level of 325 to 327 million or so. Okay. Now that statistic, 45,000, was based on an estimate that the death rate due to lack of health insurance was 1 in 1,000. Okay. So with, let's say, another 30 million people here, you were looking, without Obamacare, at a likelihood of another 30,000 deaths, 75,000 a year. Now, it never got up to 75,000 a year. That's true, in part because of the intervention of Obamacare. But we know that Obamacare left something like 30 to 35 million people on the table, not covered, never covered. It doesn't matter whose fault that was. That wouldn't have happened had a Medicare for All bill been passed in 2009, when the Democrats had complete control, okay, of Congress.
Right.
So someone could make the argument, it would be a fair argument, that the Democrats left 30,000 lives on the table to be lost each year from 2009 up to now. What I'm saying is, there's a fatalities issue here. And one can put this in very, very plain terms. To have a Medicare for All bill passed would destroy the private health insurance companies, or at least lead to great shrinkage of them. So they basically supporting cosmetic care of one kind or another. They probably wouldn't be in business anymore. They'd have to go into entirely different businesses. It's calculated that that would cause a loss of, well, in 2009, the figure calculated was 400,000. It later expanded to something like 600,000. But an econometric study in 2009 predicted that if a Medicare for All bill had been passed then, specifically the HR 676 version in 2009, yes, that would have led to a net gain of 2.5 million jobs at that time, even after loss of the 450,000 jobs from the insurance companies. One of the things Obama said when he justified not going for Medicare for All is, he said, well, I'm worried about the insurance companies and the loss of jobs there. Okay, so he was trading off the fatalities that would still remain versus the 400,000 jobs in the insurance companies versus the potential net gain of 2.5 million jobs if HR 676 had been passed. What I'm trying to say, and the question which I'm trying to raise, is these are the trade-offs that you face when you're voting on a bill of this kind. And I'm thinking that if you're going to leave fatalities on the table because people can't be covered by some bill that you're going to pass, and you're going to leave us spending 17% of GDP rather than 8.5% to 9% of GDP for the sake of not putting the health insurance companies out of business, then you have to have some real good reasons for doing so besides putting the health insurance companies out of business.
And I've got issues personally with the insurance companies. My mother passed away, Joe, in 2015. And unfortunately, when a senior gets to a point in their life, and in her case, she was bedridden for 3 years, the insurance company starts pushing the doctors to put that person in hospice, to end their life much quicker. Doesn't make sense. They just want to get them off and stop spending that money. Yet when she would go to the emergency room, everything was covered. But when she would get out of the hospital, then the doctors, her primary care, would be pushing to put her in home hospice or under hospice care. My brother and I were her advocates. We fought for her. She did not want to go into hospice. She had worked when she was younger, not in a hospice center, but in a nursing home. And she was too much aware of what happens there. So we went ahead and we advocated for her. We talked for her. And had we not, she would have gone 6 months after her first heart attack. She lasted 3 years joking, laughing, eating. We had nurses in and out of the house, and she enjoyed that time. It was quality time that she had with us and quality time we had with her. So yes, I do have issues with insurance companies, and I am against insurance companies taking control. And it is a sad situation that we're the only country, the only major industrialized country that does not insure its people. My brother had a friend who came from England, and he died in England. And back in the 80s and 70s, he had better insurance than we have here. So
yeah, he had the national health system.
Yeah.
The National Health Service. So that wasn't just insurance.
Right.
It was also care.
Right. And so there is something wrong when our country cannot take care of its people. I mean, there's something really wrong.
Okay, so here's a question that I'm going to come off of that, which is really a very important question.
I just want to say something else, Joe.
Sure, go ahead.
Because insurance companies fight to keep things the way they're going, because as far as they're concerned, they're going to lose. But they make plenty of money already just on insuring the cars, their homes, livestock. I mean, those are the same companies that are insuring health insurance. So they're not losing. They're still you're going to have to get your automobile insured someplace. You're going to have to get your home insured someplace. Your livestock, if you have a business, life insurance, profit insurance against over your partner or ownership. So they're still making money there. But that's their.
I agree. Yes, they are still making money there. They're not hurting for money.
No.
And right up until the time that there would be a Medicare for All bill, they would be making plenty of profits to put aside to reinvest in other areas if their healthcare business went. And as prudent business people, they're going to be making provisions for that. Okay. And as for the people who would lose their jobs from the insurance companies, quite a few of those people would be reemployed in a Medicare for All program by the government.
Right.
So, okay.
And I do believe in the Medicare single payer for all.
So that's HR 676, though.
Yes.
But that's not improving the Affordable Health Care Act. That's
in other words,
replacing it with HR 676.
Right. Medicare for all, a single payer program.
Okay, let me tell you something else about that, though, as well. You have, of course, the Bernie Sanders bill. I think that's 1804. There's a number of that, if I recall correctly. Okay. That bill provides for a single-payer program, but a gradual transition to a Medicare for All program over 3 years. So I'll ask you a question, which I would ask Bernie if I had him here.
Okay.
And that question is, HR 676 could be implemented in 1 year, and then no more lives would be lost to lack of insurance. Each year we delay in implementing that program.
There's more lives that are being lost.
There are more lives that are being lost unnecessarily, since we could implement that program inside of a year. We know this because the original Medicare program was implemented by Lyndon Johnson in 1966 with the very poor computer resources they had back then, within less than a year.
Right. And that's what I would say is we would need to implement that less than a year, not the 3 years. Because as you say, the longer it takes, more lives are going to be lost.
Okay, so I want to raise the following question, which I think is a very pregnant one for you to consider. In some of the things that you said here tonight, I detected kind of in the background, okay, a concern that we needed to have these things. We needed to improve our Medicare situation. We needed to improve our economy so that we had real full employment.
Correct.
Okay. We needed to improve our trade agreements so that they were fair to workers, okay, and to everybody else. Okay, but that there might perhaps be lurking somewhere in the background some cost considerations, like how much Medicare for All would cost, how much the infrastructure work would cost, how much other things would cost. Okay, so what I want to transition to now is your ideas with respect to fiscal policy. That is, the fiscal policy that has reigned in Washington for all these years now, really, since the Reagan administration, the latter part of the Reagan administration, when he was turned away from deficit spending, is that certain fiscal responsibility ideas that they have in Washington that have been championed by the Democratic Party all through this period and by the Republicans whenever the Democrats get into power, okay, but not when they get into power.
Right.
And those ideas are that things have to be paid for and that we ought to have a pay-go system and that we ought not to be running deficits. So I would like to know how you feel about that.
That I'm going to have to really do a little bit more research on in terms of the program. But I think right now we are running high deficits for a lot of unnecessary stuff.
Okay. Well, what if I were to tell you that those deficits that we are running are not near high enough?
Right.
Not near high enough.
But
okay, and what if I give you reasons for thinking that?
But people are, and when I say deficits and stuff, we need to spend more on education with our schools, with our students. They're the backbone of this country. They're the future of this country.
I completely agree, and I totally agree with you. We need to spend on the right things, and not as we've been doing, spend on the wrong things.
Right.
We can completely agree on that. I don't think
and
that's an issue.
There's a lot that goes on wrong things, but there's not a lot that they're spent. I mean, I walk through my district. I drive through the valley here. I see more and more homeless people, more and more homeless vets. More so today than a year ago.
So we need housing programs, real housing programs for people, low-cost housing programs.
Right. I see people, I once or twice a week, I will go around my entire district. I will go to the churches. I will talk to ministers, pastors. I will pass by food banks and just estimate the crowds that are going on. And it has overpopulated. I mean, there's more people today in need because there's not programs that are not there because our elected officials do not want to invest in people. And that is a situation, that is why I'm running, is because it is time we invest in people. We give our people what they need. Our veterans, our young people, our seniors. The way we're going right now, it's not right. And yet we call ourselves a caring nation. We've gotten away from caring for those in need. And that's why, being a Democrat, I'm a longtime Democrat, I'm a progressive. I believe we need to be the party of the poor, of the disabled, of our veterans. And we need to invest. And if it raises up the deficit, if we're investing in the right things, where it involves our people, I am for that.
Okay, but what if I told you, and this is not at all contradicting what you said.
Right.
I mean, I completely agree, okay, with what you said. Okay, but what if I told you that we're running right now approximately, or we're running at least, okay, before the latest antics, roughly $650 billion a year worth of deficits. And that before the latest actions of the Republican Party in Congress, that this $650 billion worth of deficit was not only too small, but that it was probably too small by as much as $2 trillion per year. Okay, I get to that figure in the following way.
Right.
We have demand leakages every year from the economy of the United States. Demand in dollars leaks to savings. When people save and they put things away, they're not spending into the private sector. They're basically taking money out of the active economy. We know from previous experience that if people had their way, they would probably save something like 6% of GDP per year. We also know from our previous experience that our trade deficit in previous years has gone as high as 6%. Now, these two figures together constitute 12% of GDP in leakages of demand from the economy. There's only one place that can make up the 12%, okay, of GDP. There's only one way it can be done in a safe way without people going into debt. And that is for the federal government to run a deficit of 12%, okay, of GDP. So this is now a mathematical question. What is 12% of $19 trillion, okay, in GDP? You can see that's a number in excess of $2 trillion.
Right.
So that's the policy space in deficit spending that really existed in the last year, okay, of Obama's time and the beginning of Trump's time, to spend on good things, if we wanted to spend on good things without having a particular type of inflation called demand pull inflation.
Right.
There might have been something we call supply push inflation, but that's another matter, and that has to do with other factors. It doesn't result from government spending. Okay, so we were spending only a fraction of what we should have been spending to get a tight, full employment type of economy, and we're still doing it, even with Trump's tax cuts. $1.5 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years. That averages $150 billion a year. So you add $150 billion to the $650 billion deficit we have now, we've still got a huge amount of policy space that's left over to spend on Medicare for all, to spend on infrastructure, to spend on a job guarantee program. If we wanted to put in a federal job guarantee program at a living wage, the gentleman I was talking to earlier, but Dr. Winfield would like to institute a federal job guarantee program at a living wage of $20 per hour. with good fringe benefits, which means actually not a job guarantee program, but a guarantee of a job offer to anyone who wants one in a social value sector of the economy, much like FDR's work that he created in the CCC, okay, in the WPA, okay, in projects of that kind. Okay, this program might be a little different in the sense that it would be federally funded but locally administered, and with the participation of the people who were part of the program. But that would be a revolutionary program in many, many ways, and it turns out to be relatively cheap. It would start out perhaps at a relatively high level, but once the economy, okay, was roaring along, to maintain that full employment would probably cost only 350 to 400 billion a year.
Right.
So it's a different story.
And that's the problem with our government right now is we have money. They don't want to spend it on our people. And that is a sad situation. They spend it on, I mean, look at our elected officials who have been there, the perks that they have. And that's why I'm for term limits. You know, if our president of the United States and various governors here in Nevada can only serve no more than 2 terms, then our members of Congress need to be term limit. I believe that the longer they serve, they're not serving because they want to do something right for the people. They're serving because they're putting their own needs first. And we need to term limit all our members of Congress, our U.S. senators, and our congressional members. I am for term limits, no more than 3 terms in the House of Representatives. And it's time to move on. Time to bring in new blood. But I think when you have congressmen and congresswomen and senators who have been there 30, 40 years, and you look at their records, they're fulfilling their own agenda, not the American people.
Okay, I tend to agree with you somewhat on that. Okay, I always also think it can work in different ways.
Right.
For example, Bernie Sanders has been in Congress for most likely close to 30 years now. Okay, getting close to 30 years anyway. Right. And he evidently has never forgotten the interests of his constituents and
right.
the interests of the American people, okay, in general.
He's an exception. There are a few of those, like Senator Sanders and who have been there for many years. And
right, but there might be a lot more people like that if we got control of the campaign finance laws.
And that is important.
And we prevented the buying of people in Congress. Then it might be much safer for people to stay in there for a longer period of time.
Right.
So I think it all depends on that in part, and that's a big factor. Okay, I also think if you term limit people, for example, let's say Congress people, you term limited then to 3 terms, then they might begin to get the idea, well, okay, I've got only 3 terms to set myself up to make a fortune after I'm done. So maybe what I have to do now is be even more corrupt. In other words, would it create that kind of dynamic for people? I don't know. Okay, it might. Okay, it's something to consider. It
right.
seems like a simple idea to limit the terms of people, but there might be unintended consequences, okay, of limiting the terms of people. And I would not necessarily go for that idea without looking at a number of different computer simulations that incorporated, a lot of different assumptions about how people would react in a situation like that.
Right. And again,
I just don't think it's obvious.
We have to approach this, which I'm a great believer. We need to have campaign finance reform.
I
We
agree.
need to get corporations out of it. We need to have a limit on what candidates can raise, because it is unfortunate that you have most candidates, unless you have PACs and corporate behind you that are raking in, it's almost $1 million in contributions. And to me, that's not running to serve the American people. That's trying to buy an election. And
I agree.
in order to, if you were a major corporation, Joe, and you gave me a check for $100,000, what am I going to have to give you in return? And so we have to really do something. We have to pass campaign finance reform, and that will eliminate a lot of major issues that are going on.
Right, but how can we do that? The Supreme Court has seemingly tied our hands in this. So how do we get around the Supreme Court? I should say, how would you get around the Supreme Court? I know how to get around the Supreme Court.
Right. I as a member, if elected to Congress, I will bring up and fight to get both members of both parties to come up with a bill on campaign finance reform. And that's what we've got to do. Right now, we talk about it. And
okay, but if they did, what's to prevent the Supreme Court from ruling that that bill is unconstitutional? In other words, they've already ruled corporations have the right to contribute to campaigns, and they've declared a number of bills unconstitutional already.
I feel that if the Supreme Court sees both parties actually doing something, and that's what the American people really want, then I feel that they've done stranger things, the Supreme Court. But I feel that that's one way to have them fall in line. I think they're waiting to see the seriousness of our members of Congress.
How much longer do they need to wait?
With the current Congress,
it's 8 years since the CU decision.
Right.
Okay. And all we've seen is outrageous spending by the corporations buying Congress people, and decision after decision in Congress in favor of corporations, and in government, rule after rule, law after law, essentially allowing the corporations and wealthy people to loot the federal government. What else does the Supreme Court have to see? Are we still there? Hello, Richard. Are you still there? Okay. I guess that Richard lost the connection, and that we're probably done for tonight. Of course, I had a lot more for him, as I think you know. But anyway, we are still here. We have 19 people here, but I think I'm going to say good night. Rocco Millions says, how are you going to pay for it? Yeah, I was wondering if in the end that maybe Richard Hart was getting a little tired of the conversation with me, which I think at a minimum tonight was giving him something to think about. In any case, let's see if he comes back. I'll give him another minute. He's back. Rich is back. Okay, Rich, I'm putting you in the broadcast again. Okay, you're back.
Yes, back. Had
Okay,
a
glad to see you back. Thank you for
technical issue here.
coming. Okay, so I was really saying, what more does the Supreme Court have to see? But I was also going to ask a follow-up question, which is, is there a way, short of a constitutional amendment, to stop the Supreme Court from overturning campaign finance laws that Congress actually passes? Okay, and I think there is a way.
Right.
And I'll tell you what that way is, okay, if you don't know it. There is a part of the Constitution. It's in Article 3, Section 2. And basically what it says is that the Congress can determine the jurisdiction over the Supreme Court, okay, over any law. So Congress could pass a campaign finance law which prohibits the Supreme Court from reviewing that law. It just takes away the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for campaign finance laws. Not only would that apply to the campaign finance laws that was passed at that point, but of course it would apply to previous campaign finance laws also, which the Supreme Court has deemed as unconstitutional, because if people attempted to enforce those laws again, the court would not be allowed to overturn them. So we could actually reinstate the previous laws that the court had overturned by using Article 3, Section 2. Now, obviously, this should be used only very rarely, but this was something the framers put in the Constitution because they believed that the court could go too far and that it needed a check. And that was a check the framers actually put into the Constitution. We have never used that check, but that doesn't mean that we cannot use it, and that doesn't mean the framers were not right to put it into the Constitution.
And this is a time to now use it when it comes to campaign finance reform.
I think it is.
Because the ones that are being affected are the American people. And it's got to stop. And it's the way we've come in this day and age, and it has to be done.
Yes, I think so too. I think it has to be done.
And then
I think it should be done without waiting for the court to make another decision about it.
We've got to ask ourselves, why aren't the members of Congress doing that right now? Why haven't they done that? As many of them,
because they benefit from it.
Right.
The incumbents benefit from it.
Right. Even though they say they're for it, I don't see a lot of our members, incumbents, who are for campaign finance reform. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's how I see it too. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to bring up. We talked a lot about the deficit financing, and you indicated that you would be for deficit financing for the right things.
Correct.
If you campaign on that strongly, you're going to get people who will say to you, what about the national debt? It's this huge burden for ourselves and our grandchildren. So you would have to be prepared to answer the question, how are you going to pay for it? Where if you respond, well, I'm going to have some deficit financing for this, they would come back and say, what about the debt? It's $20 trillion already. it's going to choke us and our grandchildren because we have to pay it back. So the question is, how do you answer that question?
I feel that by investing in people, like I said, with our schools, with our elderly, with people themselves, that is the important thing. So yes, we have this debt, but at the same time, those students coming out of schools from grade school on up, they're the core of this country. And do we want students who are not educated or students who have education because we've given them all that they need? I think that is the most important thing.
Okay, I think that's a pretty good answer to the question, but there will still be people who will say to you, this debt, this national debt we have, is just unsustainable, and they will argue it has to be paid for by increased taxes somewhere down the line. So how do you intend to pay for it? Because we know the only way to pay for it is through taxes. So how do you reply to that?
My answer to them will be pretty much is it's going to increase anyway for the wrong reasons. And there will be taxes. Taxes will go, our government will always find a way to raise taxes. So are we going to get away from tax increase? Probably not.
Okay.
Is the national debt going to go up higher? More than likely it will, for perks and everything else. So as we speak, it's going up. So
okay, so I think that's a pretty good answer. Okay, but I'd like to offer you yet another one.
Okay.
Okay. As you know, the Constitution gives the Congress the sole power to create the money of the United States. Okay, now Congress has delegated that power to the Federal Reserve. And in our system, the Federal Reserve uses that money, the reserves that are issued under the authority of the United States, to back the banking system, which issues more money in the form, of bank money,
right,
which is created at the same time as private debt is created. Okay, but Congress still retains the power itself, the constitutional power, to create the money and also to determine the conditions under which the Federal Reserve will create it. Now, here's an interesting thing. Have you ever wondered why, when Congress appropriates spending for a particular purpose, that the money for that spending is simply not immediately forthcoming into the Treasury spending account? I mean, why is that? Why do we have that situation? Right. After all, Congress has the authority to create that money, and when they do an appropriation, they're mandating the executive branch to spend that appropriation. It's a mandate. Okay, it's not an allowance of some kind. It's an order to the executive branch to spend that money on the purpose that's designated by Congress.
Right.
So why doesn't Congress actually provide that money? Is there anything logical about that? Is there anything reasonable about that? Well, it turns out there's a very simple way to get Congress to do that. And here's the simple way. You'll notice that there's a panel here, a third panel up on the screen now.
Yes.
And the third panel is called Create Overt Congressional Financing. And you can see the wording is very brief. It contains only 2 paragraphs.
Right.
In perhaps a single clause that could be attached to every appropriation bill that goes through Congress. Now, what the first clause does is it orders the Federal Reserve to place the money which has been appropriated inside the federal spending account. This obviates or removes the need for the Treasury Department. I'm sorry, did I say the federal spending account? I meant the Treasury spending account.
Right.
It obviates the need for the Treasury to do any more debt financing. It never has to do any debt financing again because it immediately gets the money from the Congress. The second clause, or the second paragraph of the clause, specifies that the Federal Reserve place the money that the Treasury needs to repay all of the outstanding debt instruments falling due during the period of the appropriation, plus the interest that is due. So there are 2 things that the Federal Reserve is ordered to put into the Treasury account. One is to pay for the current spending, okay, that has been appropriated, and the other is to pay for the past spending, okay, that was appropriated, but that was debt financed by the Treasury Department. So this means 2 things. One, it means if this were put in every appropriation bill, it would mean there would be no more debt financing going on. And 2, it would mean that all the previous debt, all 20 trillion, would eventually be paid off over roughly 30 years, because I believe the longest outstanding debt instrument is a 30-year debt instrument. So, and considering how quickly the debt turns over, within 3 years, 1/2 the debt or more would already be gone. So the debt issue would be completely off the table. It wouldn't be there anymore. So, in a way, that is the final answer to the how you're going to pay for it question. This is the way that you would pay for it, by using the authority of Congress to order the Fed to fill that Treasury account, just to avoid any more current debt in case there was deficit spending, and also to get rid of the past debt and completely take the debt issue off the table for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. That would put the Peterson Institute, the Peterson Foundation, and the deficit terrorists like Paul Ryan on the Republican side out of business.
Right.
They would no longer be in business if we got this institutionalized in Congress. Okay, so I wanted you to hear this in part because I think this can help you in your campaign, because you'll get questions like this. In other words, if you say you want to spend for all the things you want to spend for that are good for people, you're going to run up against the fiscal conservatives who are going to say, how are you going to pay for it? And some of them won't be convinced by, well, all the good things we're going to do and all the expansion of the economy, we'll take care of it because the debt will be paid back over time through taxation as the economy does better. Some people won't be convinced by that because the scale of the current spending we need to do is so high. But This clause, this little clause, takes care of the problem. There's nothing unconstitutional about it. What it means is that instead of having the pay-go system now, you would have a different system in Congress. It would be a spend pay system, and the pay would not be to pay for the spending.
Correct.
It would be only for one purpose. The pay would be to control inflation.
Correct.
Because the only real constraint on federal spending is avoiding inflation. So Congress would have to calculate every year what the needs of the people are. They'd have to spend on what is needed and what is for the public purpose. And then they'd have to tax enough and tax the right people in order to head off any inflation, that might occur.
And this is the reason, Joe, I'm running, is because we have just what you and I have discussed this evening. We've got some real issues going on back in Washington. And that's why I'm running, is because I really want and intend to do something for the people here in Nevada and for our country. I grew up in a household where my father was a labor organizer. And we were taught growing up to do and help those in need. And I'm not seeing that anymore with our elected officials.
Neither am I.
Yeah. And so I decided to get into this race because my heart is really with the people. And that's why I'm running.
Okay, but also that means your policy agenda has to be with the people too. Okay, because everybody says their heart is with the people.
No, not everybody.
We heard that, from Obama also. But we didn't get those kinds of policies from him.
I'm not every, lot of candidates or elected officials do say that. Not everybody does. I am really, I'm not running for office because I have my own personal agenda. I am not running for office because I'm after corporate money. I'm doing it the Bernie Sanders way, $5, $10 here. It's costing me more to run for office. I don't need to be running for office. I want to run for office because I want to do something. Since I was 7 years old, I got instilled by my parents that you had to give back. And I didn't grow up in a wealthy family. I grew up in a middle-class family. But we were taught that there's always somebody on the other side who has it worse off. My father was a decorated World War II veteran, and he worked hard. He taught us to work hard. Nothing is given to you. And with both my parents gone, and with how the world has become and our leadership in Congress, I felt that I needed to do my part. And just like they did, they were active in knocking on doors and working on campaigns and taught us to never miss an election, go out and vote. And that's why I'm in this. And I don't intend to not serve the American people the way they're supposed to be served, because what my parents taught me and what they instilled in me means more than doing it for personal gain.
Yep. Yes, I think that's the kind of motivation we need.
Right. And
Certainly the
that's
kind
not
of
what we're
motivation we
getting
need.
right now from Washington.
Okay, we have been on now for about an hour and a half or so. Uh, would you like to say something to summarize and to close out our interview?
Yes. Number one, Joe, I really appreciate being on here tonight with you, and hope that we can do this again. But as I said, I am one out of 6 candidates running in Nevada's Congressional District 3.
Yes.
I am running a campaign based on the issues. I'm running an honest campaign. I am not talking about other candidates. I feel that the American people and the voters are tired of that type of politics. I know I am. I've talked to each of my opponents. I have to say I like them all very, very much. I just feel that I'm the best person in going forward. I'm the best person who can represent the voters in CD3, in Nevada, and all of our country.
Okay.
And this is an important election. Not because I'm in the election, it's the most important election in my lifetime because of who we have as president.
I agree.
And our Republican friends on the other side. You know, when Paul Ryan today said that you're tired of the mass shootings that are going on, well, then don't vote for the Republicans because they're not for gun control. There is something wrong with what's going on in America. And,
absolutely. More than something wrong, it's like.
I know. And I intend to really do something. And because if I'm elected and I go to Washington and as a first-term congressman, you don't have much say-so, but you can keep your word. You can be vocal. You can fight for the principles that you're there for. If I don't
you can combine with other first-term Congress people,
right? Absolutely.
Who feel okay as you do, and there are a number of people who are running, who are coming together under the banner of the contract for American renewal. It's called CFAR.
Yes.
Okay, and I think they're getting close to 30 candidates now. And their website is, hang on a second. Okay, and let me look it up. I think it's www. CFAR 2018. I'm not sure if it's .com or .org. I should be sure, but and I will be in just a moment when I get to my messages. Okay, I've been asked to remind you about this, actually. But I've been working with the CFAR people now for a while. And they do have some very good people already signed up, including but Tim Canova is the one who was best known. He's running in Florida against Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Right.
And he came close to beating her last time and has a very good chance.
I've been following that race, and I actually think he's going to do very well. I have a feeling he's going to defeat her this time.
Yeah, so do I. I interviewed him on December 30th. and we had a 3-hour conversation then. And it was really a very, very in-depth conversation of what he wanted to do. So, he was one of the first people that CFAR signed up.
Also, want to say is that I am in favor of a living wage. And I'm also for, I didn't get into that, but I'm for student relief on their debts. It is a shame that these students are leaving college and going into, some of them can't even get into their careers because they've got so much debt to pay back. And I am for student forgiveness on their loans.
Yeah, so am I. I'm entirely for that.
Yeah, and I'm for a living wage
as well. Right, but that phrase covers a lot of sins, as I told you in by Richard Winfield's case.
Right.
He's advocating for $20 an hour. But I usually say that it should be relative to the area that you're in, because cost of living is very different in many areas across the country. So I think there should be a cost adjustment, either up or down. But I agree that it would be good to have an average, of $20. That incorporates most of the productivity gains that have occurred in the economy since the 1970s, as well as cost of living changes. So it seems to me only fair. I put up the URL for CFAR now. It's HTTP
CFAR 2018.
CFAR 2018.us.
Yes.
Okay, so I put it up on the screen now, and if you contact them, they'll show you the contract. Of course. And you learn about not only the policies in it, but also the other candidates who have signed on to it. And it's also a contract which is a minimum, for you to commit to. It doesn't stop you from advocating for more, or doing more. So it's not just what they advocate. But it kind of sets a minimum standard, across the country, that they're trying to get people who are real progressives to commit to. So that's the idea behind that.
I also wanted to clarify before ending is that I'm not in favor of the health insurance companies. I'm in favor of health care for all. We went back and forth on that. And
yes, we did.
As you were saying, we need to do something less within a year, not 3 years, because the longer it takes, there's more lives being lost. And
well, in the Bernie Sanders bill, it does do something initially. In other words, it phases the program in by thirds.
Right, but it needs to be done before.
I think so.
Yes,
I think so. I think he compromised on that because people told him it would be more acceptable if he gave the insurance companies time to adjust. But I think that, relative to the record of the past and their opposition to doing things that were needed, that at this point, I just don't have any consideration for the insurance companies. I care much more about the people who were victimized by what they were doing to the American populace.
Right. The insurance companies don't care about you or I or anybody else. They're concerned about the the big bucks that they're making, and they're not hurting. Like I said, they still have auto and fire and theft and everything else. So they can cry that they're hurting and everything else, but reality is, you and I know that they're not.
Yeah, we know they're laughing all the way to the bank, especially the CEOs. Right? Yeah. Especially the CEOs. Okay, so Rich, it was really very nice to meet you. If you would like to come back, we would certainly like to have you back.
I would love to.
Have you got a website?
Right now, website is not fully up, other than the Richard Hart for Nevada, which I believe that's our page on Facebook.
Right.
Right. And that's updated continuously with events and policy and where I'm at on the campaign. So anybody can feel free to go to Richard Hart for Nevada. A lot of the issues that I'm for and where I stand can be found there. And they can go on there and look at that. Once again, my heart is really in this. Like I said, I don't need to be running for Congress. I don't need to put my family through the stress and the hard work that goes into running for office. I'm running because I want to. I want to do this. I feel that the people deserve better than they're getting. And
yes,
and if I don't perform, if I'm elected, and I intend to be elected, but if I'm elected and I don't perform and I don't stand on my principles, I won't come back for re-election. But I will come back for re-election because I will stand firm on my principles, and that's what we need. We need to be vocal, and I intend to be vocal. And I would like to come back on your show very shortly, whenever you have your schedule permits. I've enjoyed this.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I'd love to have you back. I wonder if it wouldn't be a good time when you have your website up.
Okay.
Okay. At that point, I don't know what time frame you're planning for the website.
Should be up in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. So perhaps then after that, okay, we bring you back. Okay. And then we'd be happy to walk through your policy agenda.
Okay.
Okay, point by point. I think that would be a very good way for you to tell people what you're for.
Okay.
And so I think that would be very effective. And you could hone it also to show the ways in which you differ from your competition.
Okay.
And I think that could be very important for your campaign. I know that if I were in your district, okay, and I were voting and I had 6 people competing, then I'd be looking at, at their positions and what they stood for and the quality of the ideas that were expressed in their policies. I'd be looking at that very carefully, trying to get a feel for whether they're really ready to commit to those policies.
Right.
Okay.
Joe, I really thank you for being on.
And I thank you. I thank you for coming aboard. I really enjoyed our conversation also.
I did too.
Okay, so I'll see you soon.
Okay.
And we'll end for now.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, Rich.
Bye-bye.